Have you ever wondered why you can eat less, exercise more, and still not lose the weight? And then everyone, including your doctor, tells you to cut back on your calories. But what if calories are not the thing to watch? What if the type of food and the time of day you eat makes all the difference between storing fat and burning it? Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the #1 insulin trick to help you lose weight. And if you listen carefully and you really understand what we're talking about here today, it will probably completely change the way you think about weight loss. And everywhere people are talking about calories. You got to cut your calories, including your doctor. But the thing is, calories do matter, kind of, sort of, but not in the sense that you think. Yes, you don't want to eat 20,000 calories a day, but they're not really the thing to watch. They only matter if they come from food that raise insulin and if it raises it too much. So we have to understand that even though calories may matter to some degree, insulin is the key to follow, not the calories. And where's the proof? Well, let me give you 2 pieces of proof. The first one is that if you did an experiment and you put fat cells in a petri dish, you put them in a medium where they would have a comfortable environment, and then you feed them, you put all of their favorite foods all around them. So they're swimming around in all their favorite foods, kind of like it would be in the body. And you add glucose and you add fatty acids, which they love. So if your body cells, which is basically what this would be in the petri dish, were surrounded by glucose and fatty acids and they love it, you would think that they would gobble it up and get big and fat. But what's the result here in the petri dish? Well, instead you have tiny, skinny, little pathetic fat cells. Because what's missing is they can't do anything with all that food without insulin. No insulin, and you have starving cells. Okay then, so what would happen if you add in the petri dish, if you add insulin? Well, you guessed it. You get big, bloated fat cells. And not only that, you get it within hours. And of course, the point is that it's not really about calories because the fat cells in the petri dish had all the calories they wanted, but nothing happened without insulin. The second piece of the proof comes from understanding type 1 diabetes. And there are 10 million people in the world with type 1 diabetes, so we know exactly how this works. If a type 1 diabetic has no insulin, if he is a full-blown type 1 and we don't administer insulin, they actually starve to death, which is what happened to type 1 diabetics before we had insulin, before we had the ability to extract or synthesize insulin. And that's why they call it juvenile diabetes, because the kids would get it at an early age and they would only live at the most a few years while the disease went into its full-blown stage. And they would starve no matter how much food they have. They could gorge themselves on an endless buffet and they would still starve to death if they didn't have any insulin. And we also have the evidence from type 1 diabetics who don't take enough insulin, whether it's by accident or on purpose. If they take very, very little insulin, they don't have to be at 0 insulin, but just if they take very little and not enough, now what happens is they lose weight and they get very, very thin. Because it is possible as a type 1 diabetic to get overweight also, if you eat garbage food, if you eat processed modern food with lots of sugar and lots of starch and lots of seed oils and all the things that make you insulin resistant, and you eat a lot of that and you just take extra insulin, now you can become insulin resistant and obese even though you're a type 1 diabetic. So if you are one of those, or if you just want to lose a few pounds and you're a type 1 diabetic and you think, wow, this sounds like a good idea, then think again. Don't even think about it actually, because what's going to happen is if you under-administer insulin, you get hyperglycemia. Your blood sugar goes through the roof, and you get to the point where your glucose is passing out through the kidney, called glucosuria. But even worse than that is that you get ketoacidosis. So if you have a ton of blood sugar, but it's in your bloodstream and not in the cells are starving. And now they start breaking down the little fat they have left, and they make ketones. But with high blood sugar and really high ketones, and in the absence of insulin, you develop a life-threatening condition called ketoacidosis, which has nothing to do with the ketogenic diet. This is a very severe disease condition that only happens when you have no insulin. So don't even think about it, because you'd probably end up a really skinny corpse. So we have to understand that there are no shortcuts to health. You have to work with your body and help it find balance. So insulin is the gatekeeper. And here's a few things that insulin does if it gets out of balance. So insulin promotes lipogenesis, which means that all the excess food gets turned into fat. And that's a good thing, because if we grow up in a world of scarcity, like all the other animals on the planet do, and what was the reality for humans for as long as we've been around, except the last few hundred years maybe, then it's a good thing that excess food turns into fat, because it helps us put on some stores and it helps us survive. But when there's an abundance of food and we don't learn to eat the right foods, now we get excess insulin, we get excess food storage, and we become obese. And now another thing that insulin does becomes a problem, because if we live in a world of scarcity, it's a good thing we store some fat and then we can break it down. That's if insulin is in balance. But if insulin is in excess, now insulin prevents the lipolysis, the breakdown of fat, and we want to break down that fat so we can retrieve the energy that we stored. But with insulin being high, now we can't break that down. So the energy is stuck in the fat deposits on our bodies, and instead we get hungry and we eat more and we trigger more insulin and we store more fat, and so it goes on and on. So we must control insulin, and we must learn to do it through our lifestyle. There's no shortcut. There's no quick fix. We can't just take a pill. We can't just try to change one variable, because if we change one thing, it always affects something else, unless we do it in a way that supports the body and brings about overall balance. There's something called the dawn effect that is very well known, but also very much ignored and underemphasized, and poorly understood how it relates to the things that we do. So the dawn effect means that the body releases more hormones in the early hours before we wake up. And it does this to get us ready for waking up and for getting into the world. And these hormones are cortisol, human growth hormone, adrenaline, and glucagon. And what they do is they help generate energy when we don't have anything to eat right at the moment. And between the four of them, what they do is they increase glucogenesis, which means breaking down glycogen and making glucose out of it. So that raises blood sugar. Then it also increases lipolysis, breaking down fat and turning it into energy. And then the adrenaline has a slightly different role, because it kind of stirs you up. It increases alertness and it helps the body improve its energy utilization. But what also happens now is that anytime that the body is doing things, or for whatever reason the blood sugar goes up, again, like we learned from the type 1 diabetic, blood sugar does us no good if it's in the bloodstream instead of in the cell. So what this means is, as all of these things raise blood sugar, now we also indirectly will increase insulin. And it's not as dramatic as if we eat a meal, but it is significant and it's enough to get us going. But what this means is that we are actually a little more insulin resistant in the morning. So knowing all this, I have a question for you. Does it still sound to you like breakfast is the most important meal of the day? And then let's talk about why do we even have something like the dawn effect? Why does it even exist? And the answer is that it's part of an adaptation which has been going on for as long as humans have been on the planet. Whether you believe that's a few thousand years or millions of years doesn't really matter, because it's the same idea, and if you understand it, you can use it. See, our prehistoric ancestors had no refrigerators, and they didn't have a lot of food that they could store in a pantry or anything because it all spoiled really, really fast. So for the most part, food was scarce, and they had to get up in the morning and they had to get moving. They had to go someplace and gather food or get something done before they could eat. So the dawn effect is there. All those hormones get you ready to get out of bed, to wake up, but also to provide energy to go and find their food before they can eat anything. And the significance of this is that you are biologically determined to be, when you wake up, to be ready to move rather than to eat. Now, does this still sound like breakfast is the most important meal of the day? So this insulin trick comes in a few parts, and the first part is that knowing what you know about the dawn phenomenon, that you delay your breakfast by at least 2 hours. And if you want to, there's nothing wrong with delaying it 5 hours or more. So if you wake up and your first meal is around lunchtime, there's no harm in that. In fact, it's an excellent idea called intermittent fasting, where you eat fewer meals in a shorter time period. So you could, for example, eat your first meal at noon and your last meal at 6. But by waiting at least 2 hours, what you're doing is you're allowing a natural drop of these dawn effect hormones. And as they drop and as you get into the day, you're also going to allow your glucose and your insulin to drop to where you're a little more insulin sensitive before you eat. In the meantime, you can get up, you can get focused, you can plan your day, do a few chores if you like. And then when you eat, you focus on fat and protein so that you don't ruin this nice momentum you got going. And as simple as this little shift is, it still allows you to get the timing more in sync with your DNA. Part 2 of this insulin trick is to sleep more and stress less. And this has to do with cortisol. So first of all, obviously stress is something that produces cortisol. It has a sympathetic response when you get stressed, and your heartbeat goes up, your blood flow goes up, your breath rate goes up, your muscle tension goes up. And that happens within a split second. That's the neurological part. But then cortisol kicks in, and that's the biochemical part. If this stress response is going to go on for more than several seconds, now the body is going to try to raise blood sugar through that cortisol. But less sleep, poor sleep or insufficient sleep, has sort of the same effect. And in fact, poor sleep can raise your cortisol as much as 2 to 3 times. So poor sleep is like getting a lot of stress already just going into the day. And again, cortisol's number one job is to raise blood sugar, and as a consequence of that, we're also going to raise insulin. And of course, you can imagine what that would do to have the dawn phenomenon and be insulin resistant in addition to getting poor sleep. It's not a great recipe. And what it does, it makes you hungrier, it makes you less satisfied when you actually eat, and it gives you more cravings, and specifically cravings for carbs. So what your body is looking for to get the support it wants is to eat the right food at the right time, like we've talked about, but also to sleep enough at the right time. It's not enough to get 8 hours. It works much, much better if it's aligned with the dark and light cycle of the day. And part 3 to the insulin trick is to stabilize your blood sugar. And this could vary a few points for different people, but a good benchmark, a good rule of thumb is your fasting should be around 85, and after you've eaten, it really shouldn't rise very much. So it probably should still stay under 105. And if you're fasting a lot, if you're doing keto, if you are doing an extended fast, then there's nothing wrong with that fasting blood sugar going lower or even a lot lower. And the way you stabilize blood sugar is that you change your lifestyle to focus on healthy fat and protein as your foundation. And then you add plenty of fibrous vegetables, which means leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables, and maybe some legumes if you're not extremely insulin resistant. If you can tolerate some amount of carbs, then legumes could be okay. And then equally important is that you cut back, you eliminate sugar, you cut back on starch and processed foods, which the processed foods, of course, are usually all based on starch and sugar. And why is it so important relative to this insulin trick that we're talking about to stabilize blood sugar? And it's because if you tend to have these blood sugar swings, these blood sugar roller coasters where they bottom out after a few hours of not eating, that can also happen at night. So if you have unstable blood glucose and it crashes at night, that's going to trigger a cortisol spike. And that cortisol is going to elevate blood sugar and trigger some more insulin, of course. But the bigger thing that spike, that crash in the middle of the night is going to do is that cortisol is going to block melatonin, which is your sleep hormone, which means that now you're going to be waking up. You're going to have your sleep disrupted or disturbed. You're not going to get that sound, full, deep sleep that your body is looking for. And if you recall from the previous slide, poor sleep in turn will increase cortisol. So now we're kind of just reinforcing this loop in a vicious cycle. And here's part 4 to that insulin trick. And this is something I've heard people talk a lot about, and I've heard it misquoted, severely misstated on another video that I reviewed. And it's the coffee fallacy and the coffee truth. So we're going to go through some scenarios. So first of all, we know that in the morning, there's this thing called the dawn effect. And because of that dawn effect, we raise blood sugar, and because of it, we get an insulin spike. We get an elevation of insulin in the morning, and we're a little more insulin resistant. Well, now, if we combine that with a breakfast of carbohydrates, now we're going to get a dramatically higher insulin spike. But then there's a third scenario that a lot of people don't know about, but a lot of the people who have heard about it get very confused or misled. And that is that in the morning, we have higher insulin. Now, if we eat carbs, it's going to get much higher. But if we add coffee or caffeine to those other two variables, now we're going to get an even higher spike. And this is a true fact. It does happen because caffeine is sort of like adrenaline. It's going to feed that stress response. It's going to feed that dawn mechanism a little bit extra. But here's the part that most people get really confused about. They've heard this, they've heard about the dawn effect, they've heard about the carbs, they've heard about the coffee, and now all they hear is that you shouldn't drink coffee in the morning because they're thinking that they heard that with coffee in the morning and with breakfast, they kind of missed that part. So they think that the coffee is going to do that in the morning. And yes, there is some truth to it, but it's more like it's going to just like put an edge on it, just going to barely increase that insulin response in some people. Not so much if you are insulin sensitive, because then your body is already better at regulating this. So if you're insulin sensitive, meaning your fasting insulin is low, you have good blood sugar control, then don't worry about it. Have your coffee, because even if it spikes you a few percent, it's not going to be a problem for you. On the other hand, if you are insulin resistant, now it's still not going to be the end of the world, but it would probably be a good idea to wait about 90 minutes to allow those morning hormones to drop a little bit so that there is less effect of that caffeine spike. But here's the point that you need to understand, whether you're insulin sensitive or insulin resistant, that if you don't eat any food, if you just wake up and have the coffee, then there is nothing to store. So even if you were to bring up your insulin a little bit, there's nothing to store. So there's not a big problem. And this is why you never ever want to put the number 4 here with just coffee in the morning to compare that and put it in the same category as 2 or 3 where you're actually eating something. So here's would be my suggestions relative to this insulin trick is don't fight your hormones. Learn how they work and work with them. Breakfast is not the most important meal of the day. In fact, break fast simply means that it is the food that you eat after a fast. So it doesn't have to be in the morning. I would suggest you wait about 2 hours, or if you're doing more of intermittent fasting, more of a time-restricted feeding window, then let's just wait till lunch. I would suggest you delay coffee or other significant caffeine for about 90 minutes, especially if you're insulin resistant. And also it's going to be helpful if you get some movement in. It doesn't have to be strenuous exercise, but just a little bit of moving around before you eat. If you, let's say you wait your 2 hours, if you move at all before that, that movement is going to help use up some of that energy created by the dawn phenomenon. Remember, it's there for the purpose of helping you get up and move around. So if you're moving around, you're using that up. You're fulfilling the purpose of that dawn response. And then when you start eating, then focus on fat and protein. Make sure that you prioritize sleep. Just don't sleep a few hours when you get around to it. Realize how many benefits it has, not just metabolically, but for your brain, for your health, for your restlessness, for your balance of your sympathetic, parasympathetic, for how you feel overall. Just make it important. And if it's possible for you, at least most of the time, I think it's a great idea to have about 3 to 4 hours from your last meal until your bedtime, so that you don't go to bed on a full stomach. Your body has had some time to process that meal. And a great piece of an overall healthy lifestyle is to adopt a low carb eating habit of whole food. If you just do that, you will dramatically reduce the risk of virtually all of the modern degenerative diseases. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.